No way, Jose.
The following footage proves beyond any doubt that the tanks intentionally set the house on fire. It proves that the Branch Davidians were murdered. You can see that this tank has a gas jet on the front that shoots fire. You can also see the fire quite plainly. The tank goes into the house twice, and each time as it backs out, the fire at the gas jets is plainly visible.
We must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send.
Hey guys, you're watching No Way Jose. You can find us on the No Way Jose YouTube channel, all major audio podcatchers, and Rumble as well. Today I'll be joined again by my buddy and co-host of Already Dead, Austin Picard. We're continuing our series on Watergate. And it seems timely as ever that we're doing this since we're living in a coup, which I think when we started this, that hadn't happened yet. I think I was thinking of, when I first started this, I was kind of thinking more in the line of stuff that was going on with Trump, and a lot of the legal stuff and those type of Game of Thrones that was going on there. But we have it on the other side of the aisle now too, which makes this a little bit more interesting and timely. I also think the 50th anniversary is coming up here soon, so that makes it a little bit more timely. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're just popping in for this one, this is part 4, so go check out the other 3. You might be a little bit lost, although we're kind of breaking this up in segments a little bit, so I guess you can go and watch the other ones later. It won't be that big of a deal. But I do want to take a second to let you guys know that today's episode was brought to you by our friends over at NWJ. If you're tired of that razor burn, irritation, and ingrown hairs that are caused by those multi-blade cartridges, then these are your guys. Big Shave's been psyoping the American people for decades with their expensive multi-blade razor scam. Go back to the traditional shave. You don't need that expensive nonsense. You can shave like your grandpa used to. I mean, you can look at the design. It's a slick looking thing. Whether you're shaving your entire face or just edging up your beard, the single blades provide a barber grade shave for a fraction of the price. Upgrade your system. The standard issue includes one traditional safety razor and a box of 100 stainless steel razor blades. That's $75 for the entire year, but let's be real, you can make that last longer. I know I sure have. But if you do shave on the regular, you may want to consider the Quarter Shave Club. That puts you at about 25 cents per replacement blade. He's also got lathers and soaps. I got some of that on the way. I'll let you guys know what I think of it here soon. But go to goshaveco.com. Use Jose at checkout to get 10% off. Let them know I send you. Also do want to remind you guys, this is a COVID mandate refusing company. This company was born out of refusing the COVID mandate. Lost his job in the military and had to make a career shift, and here he is with his entrepreneurial spirit fighting the system. So support him, he supports me, we kind of support each other, all big circle jerk of supporting. So go do that. With that, let's get the homie in here. Austin, what's up, bud? How you doing?
What's up, brother? All
Good
is
to have
well,
you
man.
back. Yeah. Oh,
My
by the
God.
way, a little sneak peek. I guess this will only really be helpful for the patrons. For the people who watch this when it goes goes public, it'll have already happened. But we have Raven on our next Already Dead, so that'll be
Hell yeah.
fun.
I'm excited for that, dude.
So,
That will
yeah.
be fun.
Yeah.
That one, I'm super pumped to talk with Monica too. That'll be awesome, dude.
Yep.
But yeah, man. Other than that, here to deconstruct the myth as always, right? But
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of think that the best way to probably start is just a little rough introduction, just so we kind of like set the stage again briefly, and then immediately run into the like an insider perspective on the break-in and the burglary on the 17th. Well, honestly, I think that Eugenio Martinez one of the burglars, one of the Cubans, he actually, who was again affiliated with Operation 40 in the CIA and one of Howard Hunt's boys.
Bay of Pigs, yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
He was he basically kind of outlines a couple of operations in planning for this major operation that really wasn't supposed to happen, because they were supposed to already have been, they thought they completed their mission in a way, but in reality, I think that was more of, we'll get into the details there, but more of kind of a dupe on G. Gordon Liddy, who wasn't exactly read in on a sort of secret agenda that was taking place. And I think James McCord is one of the leaders of that secret agenda. But again, we will establish all of that with much more detail. But I do think that at this point, man, I'm starting to realize, and even as far as like one of the arresting officers, or the main one that we'll talk about, named Carl Schaffler, he has like a colleague who was also, I believe, a major in military and intelligence, and I believe that was her position. But anyway, she said something to the effect of, "Nothing happens by accident," right? She legitimately said that in context, and referred to a potential connection that, as far as that was her reaction to a question in reference to a potential connection between Carl Schaffler, the arresting officer, and the CIA, which is again, we'll establish all of that. But so I do think
get
that
a little ahead of ourselves.
100%. But what I thought was so, just like, I don't know, just something that was worth mentioning off the cuff was just that statement: "Nothing happens by accident," right? And that's what Watergate is. It's like, this was not some like it's absolutely insane that the official narrative really stands the test of time, right? It's just in the minds of the public. It still does to this day. As far as the average person, they are in no way considering reframing the reality of what Watergate was. And
It's too
that's,
complex. It's too complicated for people.
I agree.
Yeah.
Agree. It is, man. And that's
It's all
honestly,
obscured through legality, and this
this is
person
the
said this and that
sophisticated
person said
aspect of,
that. Yeah.
yeah. That's what makes this all so just difficult for people to see through, because it is sophisticated. These covert operations, clandestine, tactics and techniques, that they're hard unless you are well versed and overexposed to them. They're very hard to even kind of conceptualize in general. And a lot of them are very easily dismissed by too many people. Um, Again, off the cuff, just without even really just being open-minded enough to be willing to consider the possibility
Be
of,
willing to recognize patterns.
yeah, and
Yeah.
but also what the intelligence community has been capable of. Like, that's what's so important, I think, is that I'm so obsessed with like realizing, once I found out what my own government was capable of, that's when the veil began to fall, right? Because I was ripping it off. I couldn't handle it anymore, man. It was like, I have to get to the bottom of this to some extent, to where I know, like at least have a framework in my mind that I can feel confident about when it comes to the corruption, the level of corruption involved with these agencies, with these, and really the self-licking ice cream cone that is government, and how often they will even align with their own enemies in order to cover up a specific, whatever the case may be, some scandal such as this, right? Where people will gladly accept prison time in certain cases, right? Typically they'll receive some sort of light sentence of some kind, because they're willing to play ball. But this is, like we've said many times, the playbook they utilize. And so it's, in my opinion, man, we just have to always try and kind of highlight that as often as we possibly can. So That I
Absolutely.
think
Yeah.
is my my main point there. But so
Hmm.
to begin with, I think Jim Hogan is really just he's one of the primary sources that I used during all of this, throughout all of my research into Watergate, because his book is just one of the top three, in my opinion. I mean, there's really four that I relied on heavily, but one of the top three that I think are so extraordinarily important, and really one of only two that kind of, grapple with this alternative narrative that really stands up much more than the official narrative. And especially if you dive below the surface level to any extent, like it's it's not even a debate. It's not even in question in my mind at this point. And so he wrote this book called Secret Agenda: Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA. And it was originally published in 84. And really, I think that should be the introduction, because it's kind of it's detailed but brief, and it can really help us set the stage here for the break-in. So he begins by explaining that in the early morning hours of June 17th, 1972, 5 men were arrested in the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. They were wearing business suits and surgical gloves. They were in possession of bugging devices and photograph equipment. Within 24 hours, police and FBI agents established links between the arrested men, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, and the Nixon White House. In the meantime, a political cover-up had already begun. Evidence was shredded and burned, perjury contemplated, and justice obstructed by some of the most important officials in the U.S. government. Despite this, and despite the administration's efforts to depict the break-in as a third-rate burglary unworthy of attention, the story stuck tenaciously to the front pages of liberal newspapers throughout the United States. During that summer and fall, the press, in particular the Washington Post, pursued the issue in an alleged effort to learn the extent and nature of the administration's dirty tricks and the identities of those responsible for them. As the president's re-election neared, it became increasingly difficult for those involved to stonewall the press. An employee of one of the arrested men told the FBI that he had monitored some 200 telephone calls emanating from the DNC, which he claimed had been bugged for the first time in May of 1972. Right? Like immediately, It's just absurd to me. But so with the guidance of an anonymous source nicknamed Deep Throat, which, by the way, I found out that the original version of the book written by Woodward and Bernstein that became All the President's Men, dude, Deep Throat wasn't even in it. The final draft, the rough draft, Deep Throat wasn't even a character in it. It was a created identity after the fact and placed into the final draft. And I just always found that interesting. Like, I don't know exactly what that means, besides lending a little more credibility to what we covered in the past about how
Yeah.
Deep Throat wasn't, it was a compilation of basically sources for Woodward, who was an intelligence asset.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Woodward
yeah,
was like a new guy in the media landscape, like
yeah,
hadn't made his chops at all. And anyway, I think maybe done
nothing.
like one project,
Yep.
then then ended up having this source, Deep
Bombshell.
Throat, which literally all he was doing was mostly just reporting this work, and he latched on to Bernstein, which I guess was already a little bit more of an established name to give him that reach. And yeah, so, and this guy was Navy intelligence, so it's like, and then all of a
100%.
sudden nobody has this bombshell source that all they are doing is they're not really like critically reporting this stuff. They're just saying this thing said this thing said this.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and really, they're running a cover-up narrative, more than anything. And more, I would say their priority was to change the focus point from CIA involvement to the White House obstruction. And that was the pivotal point. We have to shift this narrative before it's set into the public consciousness at any extent. And so that was, and you'll see how well they, honestly, they succeeded in doing that, because it's very complex. But yeah, with the help of John Dean and James McCord, I mean, they succeeded. And Richard Helms, like, once you realize the personal involvement there as well between the individuals, yeah, it's not at all shocking. And so the Washington Post, though, of course, the reporters rattled the White House with a barrage of front page articles about secret campaign funds, vicious campaign practices, and much more. Soon, a Senate Select Committee was convened to explore the affair. And keep in mind the Moore Radford spy scandal that we mentioned before, right? I mean, we have all these power games at play here, right? We have McCord. I'll tell you later in more detail, but McCord at a certain point, I mean, he's threatening if Richard Helms is brought down, all the trees in the forest will fall. Like it's just so obvious what's happening here, and that was almost a year prior to yeah, it's such an insane story, Watergate. Like I said before we even started, I feel like at this point I could just talk about Watergate for the rest of my life. I don't know how happy of a person I would be, but yeah, I think it's possible. But anyway, so soon, like I said, a Senate Select Committee was convened to explore the affair, and one of the first witnesses that it heard was a former CIA officer named James McCord. A turncoat in the eyes of his accomplices, McCord was one of the men arrested in the Watergate. Infuriated by the Nixon administration's handling of the affair and fearful of receiving a draconian sentence, McCord had written a letter to the judge who presided over the criminal case against the original defendants. That letter comes in the perfect timing. Like as far as once we establish the burglary and get into the actual trial that was happening and the legal matters taking place, as the Watergate Committee formed, it's mind-boggling. But once you understand the details, you realize how they kind of leveraged the narrative. And so it's such a John Dean, labeled the hero of this affair, is the antithesis. Like it's absurd. So this turncoat McCord, who, like I said, he's one of the first witnesses that is heard. So infuriated, Nixon administration handling and all of this, right? He writes this letter, and so the letter McCord wrote that, as far as what he said in the letter, that perjury had been committed, that there were other conspirators who were yet to be named, and that political pressure had been applied to ensure the silence of those under arrest. McCord promised to tell all, and soon afterwards, so did White House officials such as John Dean. So finally, after a succession of damaging and revelations and the enforced resignation of subordinates, the president was hoisted by his own petard. The existence of a secret White House taping system was revealed, and with it, Nixon's complicity in the cover-up. So on August 8th, 1974, he announced his resignation, and public reaction to that announcement was sort of like a mixture of jubilation on the part of his enemies, of course, and then relief as far as on the part of his friends, I think, because many of them thought there were going to be much more, like, as far as investigative, like, they knew that, but they didn't want to kind of set this precedent as far as like actually going after a president at this point, for like legally going after a president. And so I don't think that was ever in the cards. And so it was all just, they wanted his resignation, right? More than anything. And so what people need to realize as well is that always in a scandal, you're going to have political enemies who are just going to latch on to the scandal and the narrative that will affect you negatively as far as your political, reputation. And so it's just very convenient for them. And that's always factoring in to these scandals and definitely played a part here. But anyway, so for nearly 2 years, the country had been blitzed by this minutia of Watergate and force-fed the images of increasingly uninteresting men. Was there anyone left who did not consider himself a reluctant expert on the subject? Probably not. I think uh, I really believe that Jim Hogan's book, Secret Agenda, is one of my favorites as far as just the reading it. It's a fun read. It's an enjoyable read. And so is White House Call Girl. I encourage you to go read that as well, because that is more written as a detective novel. And it's also a very fun read. But yeah, it's so anyway, the freaking in that letter that McCord had written, right? We have to realize, like, he was basically what he had said in that letter. It was read out loud by Judge Sirica, who they called Maximum John, right? Because his name was Judge John Sirica, and he was like basically touting that he was really excited to enforce maximum sentences at as often as he possibly could, and he kind of took that, like, he took pride in doing so. But anyway, so March 19th, 1973, James McCord sent a letter, like I said, to that judge, and he read that aloud in open court. There had been perjury committed in the trial, and also wrote that the White House had both threatened him and offered him clemency, which led to further obstruction claims. And it was all in an effort to falsely blame the CIA for the burglary. I found interesting that was McCord's take in the letter. And so the letter quickly became the center of attention, further discrediting CIA involvement, right? And that's when Dean subsequently turned prosecution key witness and falsely incriminates Attorney General John Mitchell, who never had agreed to the gemstone plans, right? And by the way, keep in mind that John Dean is kind of like out for his own interest, right? And he's trying to go out on his own accord and accumulate intelligence that could help his own personal growth as far as just his career in general, because blackmail is clearly, a currency amongst the political elite. It has never been more obvious at this point. But yeah, so like I said, Attorney General John Mitchell, he never agreed to the gemstone plans. But what they so desperately needed was they needed that narrative to be set that John Mitchell did okay this plan to break into the Watergate, because that would in essence create the White House approval for the break-in, right? Because he's the Attorney General. And so if you have the executive approval for this break-in, it's a domestic op. The CIA is not to blame. So people,
which, by the way, I do want to point out, it was always kind of alluded to that Deep Throat was a source from inside the White House.
Yeah,
which is like a key point. Which obviously later it became pretty obvious it was from the intelligence community, as opposed to some staff worker in the White House or something, which is what they were trying to make it seem like it was some hero whistleblower on the inside, when that's not at all what it was. But yeah, go on.
It was you're totally right. It was intelligence, and then intelligence assets within the CRP, which that's another thing that people aren't aware of. Like the plumbers unit was like basically created before the CRP, and it was to plug leaks. And so John Dean wasn't even in as White House counsel at the time, right, where when the plumbers were formed. But what I really think is that they set a few of these individuals aside, right, as far as the main administrative officials within the White House. They didn't want to necessarily fund all these kind of more scandalous ventures that some of these individuals, that like John Dean and James McCord and G. Gordon Liddy, were attempting to they were encouraging, like breaking into the Cuban embassy and looking for dirt on political opponents was one of the major priorities of a lot of the different plans and operations they were suggesting. But yeah, so again, John Mitchell, I think he was basically kind of framed as one of the individual. Really, the official narrative says John Mitchell ordered the break-in, and that's not true. That's just not true. So again, it just ties in the White House approval, and and it throws just smoke into the narrative. It throws us off the scent as far as CIA approval and a CIA operation here. But yeah, so mainly after these damaging revelations and these resignations and Nixon resigns, like I mentioned, the public reaction, there's a mixture, but of course his approval rating had plummeted since originally it was at 68%, and it plummeted after the scandal all the way to 27%, right? So I think just as far as the political landscape, that's worth mentioning and very interesting. I think we had mentioned it before, but yeah, so for nearly 2 years, that's all the public was hearing was Watergate on every page. They're lying in wait for the new Woodward and Bernstein piece from the Post, and so they're being force fed this false narrative. And so what we really should get into is this private detective named Lewis J. Russell was an alcoholic and a womanizer. Russell had been one of the country's foremost red hunters during the 1950s, while a top staff member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, with the HUAC. They're very notorious. And a lot of these organizations and agencies at this time that these individuals were a part of were notorious and infamous, and now widely known to have been responsible for cracking down on protesters for the Vietnam War. And like there's this one specific moment where like John Dean was a part of how he kind of like was noticed in the first place and recognized by the White House, and they were impressed by the way he conducted himself in dealing with basically forcing all these peaceful Vietnam protesters into a stadium that just ultimately became kind of like concentration camp style, as far as the environment. It was very gross, and like, they weren't at all concerned about the well-being of the protesters while they were forced into this stadium and forced to stay in the stadium. So they imprisoned like 10,000 protesters, and that was how John Dean got a reputation with the Nixon administration in the first place.
Yeah, I like to cut this guy's jib.
It's exactly what happened. And so if you research the details of Russell's life, like he says in Secret Agenda, he soon learns of his employment by McCord, and what's more, of his presence at the Watergate break-in on the night of the arrests, which make him basically the sixth burglar, right? Which there's supposed to only be 5 people. And that's kind of ridiculous. And nobody even mentions that Alfred Baldwin III is the wiretap monitor, and he's just right there in the Watergate, like across the street in the hotel, monitoring what was happening at the time. So he's the one who notified Howard Hunt, which I find interesting, because when you hear Eugenio explain, Howard goes and he takes a call in a private room, and that's when they continue on with the green lighting the op. And so it's very interesting to me how all of this played out. But yeah, so this guy, Russell was present that night of the arrests, and in an attempt to understand what Russell was doing there on that momentous evening, it's Jim Hogan studied, right, this Russell, this Lewis J. Russell, and basically he discovered that a decade earlier, all right, the burglars had been caught in, as far as like Jim Hogan, he studied this for like 10 years prior to all of this happening, right? And so what he had discovered is that basically the burglars had been caught in the act. The burglary itself had not seemed to warrant intensive investigation. And so the best efforts of the press, the Senate, and subsequently the special prosecutor were therefore applied to questions of political responsibility and culpability in the cover-up. So again, obstruction, mainly just about the cover-up itself. And so for that reason, many questions about the break-in were, of course, left unanswered, not the least of which was the true purpose. And Hogan asserts that eventually he was able to answer some of those questions by interviewing men and women whose evidence had been ignored. They, these were not, for the most part, White House officials or cabinet members, but lowly workers at the DNC, waitresses and maintenance men at the Watergate, landladies, secretaries, cops, neighbors, desk clerks, and security guards. The details they provided, Hogan says, led to a picture of the Watergate break-in that was far different from what had been transmitted via television at the time. Besides those interviews, Hogan was able to obtain, through FOIA requests and literally thousands of pages of FBI documents pertaining to Watergate. These included interviews, laboratory reports, summaries, chronologies, airtels, photographs, telephone records. Most of the material was never available to the Senate's Irving Committee, right? Which, of course, same thing happened during the Warren Commission, right? And again, like the actual timeline of this, like you have to remember, you have the JFK assassination, then you have basically the Watergate break-in, the church committee hearings, as far as Helms ordered the destruction of the files as soon as the church committee hearings were happening, right? And so we have thousands and thousands of files that were destroyed during that time. And I think that that's always important to remind ourselves of, you know. But anyway, so Hunt and McCord were secretly working for the CIA, basically, and using the White House as a cover for domestic intelligence operations that, in Hunt's case, included spying on the administration he was working for, right? And so clients of prostitutes in the Columbia Plaza apartments, hard by the Watergate complex, less than a block away, were the real targets of the bugging operation. And Watergate was not so much a partisan political scandal as it was secretly a sex scandal, right? The unpredictable outcome of a CIA operation that, in the simplest of terms, tripped on its own shoelaces. And I think that's important as well, because it really was kind of like two intelligence operations that crossed, and right, it almost is exactly what happened. And once you realize who the more the more powerful individuals, as far as it, clearly there was one was an agency and others were sort of like kind of wild operatives out for their own interest, you know. And so it's like it's sort of an intelligence operation, but independent as far as within the scope of any organization having your back. And so yeah, that's priority as well.
But an op within an op, which we've talked about those many times. That's all too common. Yeah.
Exactly what it is, man. So anyway, we get to the point of basically what I really heavily relied on was that Eugenio Martinez was one of the burglars, and he was arrested at the Watergate Hotel. And his account of the burglary was published in Vanity Fair. And it was like only 2 years later, I think it was 1974, when they actually published this. And it's hilarious because all the Cubans, they were entirely under the impression that this was a CIA operation, like an official CIA operation, you know? And so anyway, Eugenio, he gives this account to Vanity Fair in 74 and begins with this dramatized claim of fighting for the liberation of Cuba. And he said personally to Vanity Fair, "I have personally carried out over 350 missions to Cuba for the CIA. Some of the people I infiltrated there were caught and tortured, and some of them talked. My mother and father were not allowed to leave Cuba. It would have been easy for me to get them out. That was my specialty. But my bosses in the company, the CIA, said I might get caught and tortured, and if I talked, I might jeopardize other operations. So my mother and father died in Cuba. That is how orders go. I follow the orders. I can't help seeing the whole Watergate affair as a repetition of the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a fiasco for the United States and a tragedy for the Cubans. All of the agencies of the U.S. government were involved, and they carried out their plans in so ill a manner that everyone landed in the hands of Castro like a present. Eduardo was a name that all of us who had participated in the Bay of Pigs knew well. He had been the maximum representative of the Kennedy administration to our people in Miami. He occupied a special place in our hearts because of a letter he had written to his chief Cuban aide and my lifelong friend, Bernard Barker. He had identified himself in his letter with the pain of the Cubans, and he blamed the Kennedy administration for not supporting us on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. So when Barker told me that Eduardo was coming to town and that he wanted to meet me, that was like a hope for me. He had chosen to meet us at the Bay of Pigs monument where we commemorate our dead on April 16th, 1971, the 10th anniversary of the invasion. I always go to the monument on that day, but that year I had another purpose, to meet Eduardo, the famous Eduardo, in person. He was different from all the other men I had met in the company. He looked more like a politician than a man who was fighting for freedom. He was there with his pipe, relaxing in front of the memorial, and Barker introduced me. I then learned his name for the first time, Howard Hunt. There was something strange about this man. His tan, is not the tan of a man who is in the sun. His motions are very meticulous. The way he smokes his pipe, the way he looks at you and smiles. He knows how to make you happy. He's very warm, but at the same time, you can sense that he does not go all into you or you all into him. We went to a Cuban restaurant for lunch, and right away, Eduardo told us that he had retired from the CIA in 1971 and was working for Mullen and Company. I knew just what he was saying. I was also officially retired from the company. 2 years before, my case officer had gathered all the men in my company unit and handed us envelopes with retirement announcements inside, but mine was blank paper. Afterward, he explained to me that I would stop making my boat missions to Cuba, but I would continue my work with the company. He said I should become an American citizen, and soon I would be given a new assignment. Not even Barker knew that I was still working with the company, but I was quite certain that day that Eduardo knew. We talked about the liberation of Cuba, and he assured us that the whole thing is not over. Now, keep in mind, this is before he gets the position in the White House. The Hunt goes to Miami to meet Eduardo, or to meet Eugenio Martinez and the rest of the Cubans, right? Bernard Barker, and recruit them for this job. They didn't know it was going to be Watergate at this time, but I think that it's very interesting as far as, to me, he's clearly going to Miami for operational purposes, right? And he's clearly going to Miami to recruit the Cubans, who he then later uses in this operation. And so this is well before he gets the job from Charles Colson in the White House, right? And so I think that the mission was already a go, right? And once he did the fake retirement, joined Mullen, and was clearly already and still remained in the Office of Security, the covert, clandestine, office that only spoke with Helms or reported to Richard Helms, the director. So, yeah, it makes sense to me that they would have these sheep dipped almost. They're kind of sheep dipped in a way, right? But they're like double covert operatives. It's strange, but it's clearly what they do. And when you realize what Mullen and Company was, and then later who else was involved with Mullen and Company, that was involved with Watergate, it's just, man, they used Mullen and Company to overthrow our Benz. In Guatemala, they used Mullen and Company. In Chile, you know what I mean?
It's almost like they use CIA funds to buy these companies, and then once they're out, they go to these companies, and now they're run by the guys who are out. And in a certain sense, they are out. So it's like they get to run. They have this like incredible amount of autonomy because they're kind of in the private and the public,
right? Yeah, and it'll surprise you how lucrative these companies are, and what they'll do is they'll utilize their own operatives to kind of they'll kind of compete for
they'll almost always be government contract jobs.
That's what I mean. They're cover contracts. What they really are cover contracts for the CIA, is what Mullen and Company was doing. They had a lucrative cover contract with the CIA, 100%. It was proven. They shut down after Watergate exposed them as a front for the CIA. The CIA actually founded Mullen and Company, so it's a little different than even let's say like Alphabet and In-Q-Tel and things of that nature, right? Like Alphabet that created Google was funded by In-Q-Tel, the venture capital firm of the CIA. You know what I mean? It's like that's typically how they operate, but they were a little more sloppy in terms of Mullen and Company because
Well, it was during this period of time, like around that
they probably
CIA
learned.
shakeup. Yeah, it was like this is where we
Yeah.
had like the Wackenhut stuff and like all
100%, man.
sorts of like all these different companies during this period of
Go
time.
private. Yeah.
What like late 70s to like mid 80s probably roughly. What like that period where it was like the CIA was like almost becoming this, a creating a second private CIA essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. A private intelligence network is basically and essentially what they created, and that Mullen and Company. You're right. It was probably one of their lessons that they had to learn, but it's kind of interesting because who Howard Hunt was competing with another individual over the contract. He ultimately wanted to be the executive that ran the Mullen and Company cover contract for the CIA because he knew how lucrative that contract was because he worked there as an executive and an official figure there. And so, yeah, it's very interesting as far as who was running Mullen and Company at that time and whose son had a desk in the Watergate. Yeah, it's a little strange because that could also create a potential motivation for the break-in as well. But so anyway, to finish Eugenio's account of how all this kind of happened, like he said, not even Bernard Barker knew that he was still working with the CIA after he was sort of granted this secondary cover as far as his operational procedure was concerned. Like, I can't believe that they basically set him up and brought them all to DC after they first sent him to LA. It's kind of crazy how involved they were. So he was quite certain though that day that Eduardo knew, he says. So we talked about the liberation of Cuba and he assured us that the whole thing is not over. Then he started inquiring, what is Manolo doing? Manolo was the leader of the Bay of Pigs operation. What's Roman doing? Roman was the other leader. He said he wanted to meet with the old people, get the crew back together. It was a good sign, says Eugenio. We did not think he had come to Miami for nothing. Generally, I talk to my CIA case officer at least twice a week and maybe on the phone another 2 times. I told him right away that Eduardo was back in town and that I had had lunch with him. Anytime anyone from the CIA was in town, my CO always asked me what he was doing. But he didn't ask me anything about Eduardo, which was strange. I think it's so cool to get his perspective, mainly because you get to see kind of the terms they see the world in. It's like this. It's just, I love getting that fly on the wall moment, right? And it felt like that's what I found when I discovered this account, right? It really did. So that was in April, he says. And in the middle of July, and remember the break-ins in 72. So this is 71. And in the middle of July, Eduardo wrote to Barker to tell him he was in the White House as a counselor to the president. I just think it's hilarious. Like, he goes and I got the crew back together, and then he goes to Colson, who Charles Colson already had a position in the White House with Nixon, and he knew Colson because he served directly under him in the fraternity at Brown. You know what I mean? So he has a personal in, and he was the one seeking the job. It wasn't Colson looking to fill some position within the administration. That's a key and important note, I think. But anyway, so Eduardo wrote to Barker to tell him he was in the White House as a counselor to the president. He sent a number of memos to us on White House stationery, and that was very impressive, So I went back to my CO and said to him, Hey, Eduardo is still in contact with us, and now he is a counselor of the president. A few days later, my CO told me that the company had no information on Eduardo except that he was not working in the White House. Well, imagine. I knew Eduardo was in the White House. What it meant to me was that Eduardo was above them, and either they weren't supposed to know what he was doing or they didn't want me to talk about him anymore. Knowing how these people act, I knew I had to be careful. So I said, well, let me keep my mouth shut. Not long after this, Eduardo told Barker there was a job, a national security job, dealing with a traitor of this country who'd given papers to the Russian embassy. He said they were forming a group with the CIA, the FBI, and all the agencies, and that it was to be directed from within the White House, with jurisdiction to operate where all the others did not fit. Barker said Eduardo needed 2 more individuals, and he had thought of me. Would I like my name submitted for clearance? I said yes. To me, this was a great honor. I believed it was the result of my sacrifice for the previous 10 years, from my work with the company. In that time, I had carried out hundreds of missions for the US government. All of them had been covert, and most were very dangerous. 3 or 4 days later, Barker told me my name had been cleared, and several weeks after that came the first assignment. Get clothes for 2 or 3 days and be ready tomorrow, he said. We're leaving for the operation. Barker didn't tell me where we were going, and I did not ask. I was an operative. I couldn't afford to be aware of any more sensitive information than was critical for the success of my mission. There would be times when I would take men wearing hoods to Cuba. They might have been my friends, but I did not want to know. Too many of my friends have been caught and tortured and forced to talk. In this kind of work, you learn to lose your curiosity. So it was not until I got to the airport in Miami that I discovered we were going to Los Angeles. There were 3 of us on the mission. The third man, Philip de Diego, was a real estate partner of ours. He is an old company man and a Bay of Pigs veteran whom we knew we could trust. In all my years in this country, I had never been out of the Miami area before that day. I had always been on 24-hour call. I kind of expected my CO to ask where I was going, but he simply said it was fine for me to take a few days off, that there wasn't much to do at that time. I sort of thought he did not want to know what I was doing. We stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel and met in Eduardo's room for our only briefing. As we walked in, I noticed the equipment devices to modify the voice, wigs and fake glasses, false identification. Eduardo told us all these things belong to the company. Barker recognized the name on Hunt's false identification, Edward J. Hamilton, as the same cover name Eduardo had used during the Bay of Pigs. The briefing was not like anything I was used to in the company. Ordinarily, before an operation, you have a briefing and then you train for the operation. You try to find a place that looks similar and you train in disguise and with the code you are going to use. You try out the plan many times so that later you have the elasticity to abort the operation if the conditions are not ideal. Eduardo's briefing was not like this. There wasn't a written plan, not even any mention of what to do if something went wrong. There was just the man talking about the thing. We were to get into an office to take photographs of psychiatric records of a traitor. I was to be the photographer. The next day, we went to Sears and bought some little hats and uniforms for Barker and Felipe. They were supposed to dress up as delivery men and deliver the photographic equipment inside the office. Later that night, we would break in and complete the mission. They looked kind of queerish when they put on the clothes, the Peter Lorre type glasses and the funny Dita beard wigs. But that was not my responsibility, so I waited in the car while they went to the office of Dr. Fielding to deliver the package. Just before leaving, Barker had whispered to me, "Hey, remember this name? Ellsberg." Daniel Ellsberg was a military analyst who, while employed by the Rand Corporation, became a whistleblower and helped facilitate the end of the Vietnam War by releasing a top-secret Pentagon study of U.S. government decision-making in relation to the war effort. Eduardo had told him the name, And he told me because he was worried he would forget it. The name meant nothing to me. Barker and Felipe were supposed to put the bag inside the office. I find that uh, um, kind of a it's kind of a irresponsible assumption of Eduardo here, or not Eduardo. I keep calling Eugenio Eduardo of Eugenio because honestly, Barker or Hunt, Eduardo, Howard Hunt, he doesn't do anything by accident from everything I can tell. And as you'll see and come to find that when Eugenio pulls off like a luggage tag from the airport off of a briefcase that Howard Hunt had on him. And it was when they were going to perform the job in the Watergate, I believe. And Eugenio removes that luggage tag, and Howard Hunt freaks out, and he reprimands him, and he tells him, "I don't do anything for no reason, right? Or unless there's a reason." That's what he said. And so for me, I feel like, yeah, Eugenio's being irresponsible when he's just thinking that Howard Hunt's they kind of worship this guy in a way, the Cubans, you have to. I don't think they thought that he was going to betray them at any extent, or
Mhm.
I really don't think that they believed that, especially after their experience with him during the Bay of Pigs. And that's why I thought this was such an interesting perspective, because once you see the sloppiness of it all, you realize how the operators themselves, like Eugenio the Cuban and the other Cubans, they were questioning the entire scenario. Like, this makes no sense operationally speaking. These are flawed tactics. We would never do this. These are mistakes, right? Novice
Yeah.
mistakes. And so,
His sect of people, with the whole Bay of Pigs situation,
yeah,
would give these Cubans this false sense of like camaraderie, of that they have this great level of rapport, because they probably did interact a bunch, and they know that his sect of people, it was the whole CIA thing, was they were trying to essentially force Kennedy into bringing the U.S. into it, and he didn't go for it, and it blew up the operation as a
right,
result. But like clearly their angle was that, and so when he didn't, it was kind of like fuck that guy, like, so they got to be like,
100%.
we're on your team here, so they but not for any love of the Cubans. It's
Right,
for their geopolitical fucking games. So
right,
that's
exactly,
what it came down to, and power games really. So the fact
100%.
that they would let them get embarrassed like that and not go along with it. So yeah.
Hmm. No doubt, man. And so, this whole scandal with the break-in of Dr. Fielding's office, I mean, it's ridiculous because, I mean, you remember that when they went to first, when Hunt took Liddy to go scope out Dr. Fielding's office, right? Remember, he has him stand in front of Dr. Fielding's parking placard and takes his picture. And again, there's like no reason you would ever do this if you were actually running a legitimate operation that didn't have some sort of underhanded agenda happening here, because Liddy is the face of the White House in this circumstance. And so, yeah, of
Yeah,
course you would
doesn't
want.
he flamboyantly kind of gets the film process. I don't know
Oh
where
yeah.
at, but just like any old place, like you used to do
Oh
back in the
yeah.
day, go to
Goes
like a
out of his
CVS or
way
whatever.
to get it
Yeah.
publicly printed. And then even the guy who developed the film, he there's this aside, he like says something like, some cloak and dagger, real cloak and dagger stuff, huh? Like, like he literally says that, has that statement made when they go to pick up the film. I just thought it was so hilarious. But you would never do that, man. I mean, there's just no way you would ever. And that's exactly what the Cubans say. It's like, what are you doing? This is a huge flaw. And Eugenio began to question everything. He didn't even want to go to DC that second time, and really the only reason he did was because he was kind of scared not to. At least that's kind of the impression he leaves, right? Which is very interesting to me. But so yeah, Eduardo told him, um, Ellsberg. He told him the name. And so, yeah, I guess Barker and Felipe were supposed to put this bag inside the office, unlatch the back door, and then come out. After the cleaning lady left, then they were to go back in. And now, here's the problem. It happened that we had to wait for hours and hours because no one had figured out when the cleaning woman would leave. Finally, I believe a gentleman came in a car and picked her up. So at last, we went to open the door, and what happened? The door was locked. Barker went around to see if the other door was open, and after a long wait, he still did not show up. We didn't know what to do. There had been another man in the briefing the night before in Eduardo's room who hadn't said anything. Later, I learned it was probably Gordon Liddy. But at the time, I only knew him as George. So they're keeping the Cubans in the dark, dude. The Cubans have no fucking idea what's happening. They're like, we're not asking any questions, but this is weird as shit. So just at that moment, he came up. So this George guy, right? Or no, just at that moment, he came up to us and said, okay, you people go ahead and force one of the windows and go in. All right. Eduardo had given us a small crowbar and a glass cutter. I tried to cut the glass, but it wouldn't cut. It was bad. It wouldn't cut anything. So then I taped the window and I hit it with this very small crowbar, and I put my hand in and unlocked the window. According to the police, we were using gloves and didn't leave any fingerprints. But I'm afraid that I did because I didn't wear my gloves when I put the tape on the window, Sometimes it's hard to use gloves. This is Eugenio, dude. I went all through the offices with my bare hands, but I used my handkerchief to wipe off the prints. Inside the doctor's office, we covered the windows and took out the equipment. Really, it was a joke. They had given us a rope to bail out from the second floor if anyone surprised us. It was so small, it couldn't have supported any of us. This was nothing new. It's what the company did in the Bay of Pigs when they gave us old ships, old planes, and old weapons. Hearing Detective James Rothstein's account of the Essex, by the way, which was one of the ships that arrived and would run bombing runs, basically, right off the coast. And yeah, it's kind of an insane story because they were just, after JFK pulled the air support, just hearing the perspective. This is a covert. If you know about the Essex, you ran covert operations. Like that's 100% what, as far as the way that when Detective James Rothstein arrested Frank Sturgis as he was going to assassinate Marita Lorenz, Castro's, basically, she claimed she had an illegitimate child with Fidel Castro, but she was basically sent there by the CIA to kill him. So anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But when Frank Sturgis was arrested, Frank Sturgis, one of the 5 Watergate burglars responsible during the break-in, also an Op 40 Bay of Pigs guy. So anyway, it's just absolutely insane because once you realize like what James Rothstein and when he arrested Frank Sturgis, I've totally just lost my damn train of thought. Son of a bitch.
Yeah, well, we were at he broke in with the crowbar.
Oh yeah, the Essex.
Yeah.
The Essex.
Yeah, the
that
Essex,
was it.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Anyway, so the way that he actually gained the trust of Frank Sturgis when he was interrogating him for over 2 hours was by telling him about the Essex and his time on that vessel, because James Rothstein was military intelligence, right? And so it's very interesting that he was involved in the covert op during the Bay of Pigs, and that allegedly, according to him, when they were sent to Cuba off the coast of America, they had no clue until they got down to Miami. They were like, we're not fucking going, we're going the wrong way if we're going where they claim we're supposed to go. So it's like really crazy how they were even sent there, the first ships. And then, but anyway, the fact that that's what he used to gain Frank Sturgis's trust was kind of nuts, because Frank Sturgis said himself, like, the only way you would know about the Essex is if you were there.
If you're spooked up, yeah.
Yeah, as if you were there. And I just think that, man, especially when you find out what Frank Sturgis said to Rothstein, it's pretty amazing. And he ends up even launching a lawsuit against him to try and keep him from talking about it, because he claimed himself there were too many powerful people, right, who demanded the cover up, and they were not going to allow any of that to ever surface.
Oh,
So, no, absolutely not. So anyway, Eugenio's complaining about the obviously the what was given to them for the operational procedures, and so they explained that if you were caught in one of those operations with commercial weapons that you could buy anywhere, you could be said to be on your own, right? So they could leave you out to dry, and so they teach you that they are going to disavow you. The company teaches you to accept those things as the efficient way to work, and we were grateful. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had any help at all. In this operation, it seemed obvious they didn't want it to be traced back to the White House. Eduardo told us that if we were caught, we should say we were addicts looking for drugs. I had just set up the photographic equipment when we heard a noise. We were afraid. Then we heard Barker's familiar knock and we let him in. I took a Polaroid picture of the office before we started looking for the Ellsberg papers, so we could put everything back just as it was before. But there was nothing of Ellsberg's there. There was nothing about psychiatry, not one file of sick people, only bills. It looked like an import-export office more than a psychiatrist. The only thing with the name of Ellsberg in it was the doctor's telephone book. I took a photo of this so that we could bring something back. Before leaving, I took some pills from Dr. Fielding's briefcase, vitamin C, I think, and spread them all over the floor to make it look like we were looking for drugs. Vitamin C, bro? Like, did they have nothing else? I just thought that was funny.
Well, if you threw it to the ground, it would make sense of like, oh, this isn't it.
Yeah,
This is
well,
bullshit.
fuck,
Yeah,
I don't want vitamin C. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
right. You're totally
yeah.
right. That's hilarious. But Eduardo was waiting for us outside. He was supposed to be keeping watch on Dr. Fielding so he could let us know if the doctor was returning to his office. But Eduardo had lost Dr. Fielding and he was nervous. A police car appeared as we drove away and it trailed behind us for 3 or 4 blocks. I thought to myself that the police car was protecting us. That is the feeling you have when you are doing operations for the government. You think that every step has been taken to protect you. Back at the hotel, Barker, Felipe, and I felt very bad. It was our first opportunity, and we had failed. We hadn't found anything. Yes, I know, but they don't know it, Eduardo said, and he congratulated us all. He said, well done, and then he opened a bottle of champagne, and he told us, this is a celebration. You deserve it. I told Diego and Barker that this had to have been a training mission for a very important mission to come, or else it was a cover operation. I thought to myself that maybe these people already had the papers of Ellsberg. Maybe Dr. Fielding had given them out, and for ethical reasons, he needed to be covered. It seemed that these people already had what we were looking for, because no one invites you to have champagne and is happy when you fail. The whole thing was strange. But Eduardo was happy, so we were happy. He thanked us, and we left for the airport. We took the plane back to Miami, and we never talked about this thing until we were all together in the District of Columbia jail. In Miami, I again told my CO about Eduardo. I was certain that the company knew about his activities then. But once again, my CO did not pursue the subject. Meanwhile, Hunt started to do more and more things that convinced us of his important position in the White House. Once he called Barker and told him the president was about to mine Haiphong Harbor. He asked us to prepare letters and a rally of support in advance. It was very impressive to us when the announcement of the mining was made several days later. I made a point of telling my CO at our next meeting that Hunt was involved in some operations and that he was in the White House, even if they said he wasn't. After that, the CIA chief of the Western Hemisphere asked me for breakfast at Howard Johnson's on Biscayne Boulevard, and he said he was interested in finding out about Howard Hunt's activities. He wanted me to write a report. He said I should write it in my own hand in Spanish and give it to my CO in a sealed envelope. Right away, I went to see my CO. We were very close, my CO and I, and he told me that his father had once given him the advice that he should never put anything in writing that might do him any harm in the future. So I just wrote a cover story for the whole thing. I said that Hunt was in the Mullen and Company and that a White House and things like that weren't important. What I really thought was that Hunt was checking to see if I could be trusted. Little by little, I watched Eduardo's operation grow. First, Barker was given $89,000 in checks from Mexican banks to cash for operational money. And then Eduardo told Barker to recruit 3 more men, including a key man. He signed up Frank Sturgis and Ronaldo Pico. And then Eduardo flew down to talk to our friend Virgilio Gonzalez, who is a locksmith, before recruiting him. Finally, orders came for us to report to Washington. The 6 of us arrived in Washington on May 22nd and checked into the Manger Hay Adams Hotel in time for Eduardo's first briefing. By that time, Liddy, whom he had known as George from the Fielding break-in, was taking a visible role in the planning. Eduardo had started calling him Daddy, and the 2 men seemed almost inseparable. I just think that's fucking
We'll probably
weird.
get into the gay shit next episode.
Oh, yeah, no. That'll come with Carl Schaffler. But I'm just saying, like, that was, especially after I found that claim by Carl Schaffler, or at least by Robert Merritt and Douglas Caddy. And basically everyone realizes that most of these individuals involved in Watergate were gay. And it's a very strange thing.
Really? I think it's becoming more and more obvious now, too. That's become a little bit more of a talking point these days with characters like, you see people like Kamala and her husband, or Tim Walz, or hell, who's that? What was it? Jeffrey Hakeem, or I don't know. There was some black Republican that everyone always makes fun of for being gay, and there was like, wedding photos recently. Everyone was roasting him, saying it was like, look at this homo, and it's like, but it's a we've talked about this before. It's a vestige of the past that now, like, I feel like it's becoming to the point to where it's like almost a joke, because being in the closet no longer makes sense. So now it's, but there's still so many people, because they're of an older generation, they're still in this system that are of that, and they're too deep in now that there's not really an easy pivot to, oh, I'm gay and now I'm living my real life, but I've just been in the closet this entire
100%.
time. It's been far too long for people to have sympathy. Like, if you've done it in like the early 2000s and you're like, hey, I've been living a lie, I feel like I need to go. Like, people would have sympathy and probably you could make it work.
Right.
Now it's like you're 20 years past where anyone gave even the slightest fuck.
100%.
Like, at least like a real
dude.
fuck,
I think that's why, like, you see like Confessions of a DC Madam and Deborah Jean Palfrey, the DC Madam, and I just found out I never heard about this fucking story about Todd Palin. Have you heard about this? Sarah Palin's husband?
Was he like an
I
obviously
had
gay
no
dude?
fucking idea. Yeah, I figured that's who you assumed it was, but yeah, Todd Palin, Sarah Palin's husband. There's this book, dude, and it's written by Shaylee Tripp, and it's called Boys Will Be Boys: Media, Morality, and the Cover-Up of the Todd Palin Shaylee Tripp Sex Scandal. And apparently this shit is just the modern form, kind of, in many ways, because Shaylee Tripp was this massage therapist who was running this call girl operation in Alaska as a single mother with a special needs child. And her and another girl were living in this 2-bedroom apartment, and they began running ads on Craigslist, right, for like massages with happy endings, basically. And according to Tripp, Todd Palin was not only her client, right? He also was sending her clients to keep notes on for blackmail purposes. And so she passed 4 separate polygraph tests from FBI agents, and a story ran on the National Enquirer and then was basically just covered up with all these counter stories ran by the Post. It's so similar to all these different things, like the Ben Bradley Post cover up of Watergate, and then down to the DC Madam with Henry Vincent. It's the same fucking thing. And then this happened with this Shaylee Tripp. And yeah, like, well, like, I think almost 30 different law enforcement agencies were involved in the raid at her home. And this is supposed to be some small time Craigslist ad operation. And then and then Homeland Security and the FBI are there, right? And so of course, local Anchorage police and everything were all sent to shut down this small time operation. And so she then subsequently pleads guilty and chooses to remain silent because she had allegedly been given the advice, right? Just keep your damn mouth shut. Yeah. And it was basically her first offense, so she didn't really receive a prison sentence at all. And so the police chief in Anchorage, this is also crazy. He puts out this press release denying these allegations made against Todd Palin, claiming that they had gone through all her stuff, all her computer, everything, her address book, and through all of that, all of the investigations, the searches that they conducted, they found no evidence. They found no connections to Todd Palin. And so then the police chief later makes a statement admitting that he never actually wrote that original statement, and it had actually been written by Sarah Palin's attorney, which was then issued on their letterhead. And I was just like, okay, let me find one more thread that I can pull on where we just fully disclose this sexual blackmail operation at the highest level of government. And of course, all of this happens during the time that Palin's running for VP for McCain, right? And so McCain's like, his team's running investigations on her behalf, like just like covertly on her behalf. Squash this shit up 100%. Yeah, I just found that so crazy but of course, like, I was not at all shocked, but fuck, man, the tale is old as time. We continue to see.
Yeah,
so
and it'll circle back around to that with this, but I think we're still at the final burglary. Burglary. That's a fun one. Fucks me up sometimes, but all right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you want me to keep going?
Yeah. Let's keep going with let's finish out the burglary, and then I think the next episode touch on the arresting officer, which then kind of obviously unfolds a huge big can of worms that descends into our final,
no doubt,
of this series.
Yeah, especially when you realize the reaction and the divided loyalties that were being carried out as soon as everyone was arrested, right? And the Watergate committee was formed. You discover the secret agenda becomes so much more clear, because you realize who the players actually are, because they're forced to kind of raise their heads above the surface for a brief moment, and we catch a glimpse, and it makes the argument a much more conclusive for me as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, when McCord was met for the first time, as far as Eduardo said, he was an old man from the CIA who used to do electronic jobs for the CIA and the FBI. Now, keep in mind, James McCord, all right, he really comes into the picture because A, they needed a loyal wiretapping expert, all right, and B, Hunt and the CIA, Helms, essentially needed someone to convince Liddy that the operation went as planned for the CRP, while simultaneously directing the operation, which CRP committee to re-elect the president, but while simultaneously directing the operation toward the secret agenda of achieving the CIA's true objective. So it becomes more clear, but once you realize which desk they were tapping. So anyway, so the way that they describe McCord to the Cubans is, yeah. Eduardo said, Hunt said he's just an old man from the CIA who used to do electronic jobs for the CIA and the FBI. We did not know his whole name. Eduardo just introduced him as Jimmy. He said and the fact that Howard Hunt is calling G. Gordon Liddy daddy is fucking weird, man. Like,
Yeah.
it really is weird. But it made me think that something gay was going on between them, which
Yeah.
it seems like it's something was happening with spooks at the time, intelligence agents at the time, and operatives at the time, where I've heard these arguments that they viewed fucking a guy as basically you were basically just you were proving domination and power over that guy. It was basically what you were doing. I forget how it was exactly worded, but
Yeah.
it's sort of like prison context, you know, like it's
Yeah, this whole time I was just imagining a Brokeback Mountain like movie, but instead
Yeah.
of like westerns, it's like two spooks on missions and they're star-crossed lovers, and I think
100%, dude.
we could really sell this.
Dude, at this point, as long as it was some sort of like positive conclusion,
Yeah.
and as far as the CIA is concerned, it would definitely get greenlit in Hollywood.
Yeah, we can make it happen.
For sure. So yeah, they didn't know his whole name. They thought his name was Jimmy, and he said we would be using walkie-talkies, and Jimmy was to be our electronics expert, says Hunt. So there was also a boy there who had infiltrated the McGovern headquarters. I was curious to know what age that boy was, because I wondered why Eugenio said boy. You know, like that's
Yeah,
I couldn't find anything.
that could
You
be a
know,
20-year-old.
it easily could have, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. But I always
Yeah.
kind of have worst case scenario in my mind as far as what I assume more often than not in these circles. But
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. I remember when
Yeah.
I heard that too. It did peak up my ears, and
Mhm.
like, I don't know, like what the fuck are y'all doing?
Right, especially since later he like balks at the whole idea of the McGovern break-in, and they basically lose the boy as an asset altogether. But so there was no mention of Watergate at the first meeting, and Eduardo told everyone there that he had information that Castro and other foreign governments were giving money to McGovern, and that we were going to find the evidence. And so the boy was going to help them break into the McGovern headquarters. But Eugenio says, I did not pay much attention as far as that was concerned, because he wasn't going to be in on that operation. So he had some free time. And during that day, he says, I went off to see the different sites around Washington. I like those things, particularly the John Paul John's Monument and the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Remember that prior to this, all of my operations for the U.S. were maritime. After 3 days, Eduardo aborted the McGovern operation. I think it was because the boy got scared. Anyway, Eduardo told us all to move into the Watergate Hotel to prepare for another operation. So this is when they move into the Watergate Hotel. And we brought briefcases and things like that to look elegant. We registered as members of the Emeritus Corporation of Miami. And then we met in Eduardo's room. Believe me, it was an improvised briefing. Eduardo told us he had information that Castro money was coming into the DNC, or the Democratic headquarters, not McGovern's, and that we were going to try to find the evidence there. Throughout the briefing, McCord, Liddy, and Eduardo would keep interrupting each other, saying, well, this way is better, or that should be the other way around. It was not a very definite plan that was finally agreed upon. But you are not too critical of things when you think that people over you know what they are doing, when they are really professionals like Howard Hunt. The plan called for us to hold a banquet for the Emeritus Corporation in a private dining room of the Watergate. This was probably my favorite part of the whole fucking story. I'll be honest. just because it felt like Weekend at Bernie's. Like, it was so fucking stupid how this whole situation happened. But
on a big fake fucking dinner.
100%. So the room had access to the elevators that ran up to the 6th floor where the DNC headquarters are located. Once the meal was underway, Eduardo was to show films and we were to take the elevator to the 6th floor and complete the mission. Gonzalez, our key man, was to open the door. Sturgis, Pico, and Felipe were to be lookouts. Barker was to get the documents. I was to take the photographs. And Jimmy McCord, who was really McCord, was to do his job. We were all ready to go, but the people in the DNC worked late. Eduardo was drinking lots of milk. He has ulcers, so he was mixing his whiskey with the milk. We waited and waited. Finally, at 2 a.m., the night guard said we had to leave the banquet hall. So then there was a discussion. Eduardo said he would hide in the closet of the banquet room with Gonzalez, the key man, while the guard let the rest of us out. As soon as the coast was clear, they would let us back in. But then they couldn't open the door. It is difficult for me to tell you this story. I do not want it to become a laughing matter. More than 30 people are in jail already, and a lot of people are suffering. I spent more than 15 months in jail, and you must understand that this is a tragedy. It is not funny. But you can imagine I know it's fucking funny, Eugenio. But you can imagine Eduardo, the head of the mission, in the closet. He did not sleep the whole night. It was really a disaster.
Kind of a symbolic theme of the whole thing, really. But
it really is, dude. They just left Hunt in the closet, dude. So yeah, they're all gay. Damn it, man.
It's like the South Park episode. Like, come on, come out of the closet. Yeah, come out. It's fine.
Tom Cruise don't come out in the closet. I'm gonna shoot someone. And then I pulled out my gun. Fucking R. Kelly, dude. Oh my god.
Yeah.
So more briefings, and we decided to go the next night. This time, the plan was to wait until all the lights had gone out on the 6th floor of the Watergate and then go in through the front door. They gave us briefcases, and I remember that there was a customs tag hanging on Eduardo's case. So I pulled it off for him. He got really mad. He said that every time he did something, he did it with a purpose. I could not see the purpose. But then, I don't know. Maybe the tag had an open sesame command to let us in the doors. Anyway, all 7 of us in McCord's army walked up to the Watergate complex at midnight. McCord rang the bell, and a policeman came and let us in. We all signed the book, and McCord told the man we were going to the Federal Reserve office on the 8th floor. It all seemed funny to me. 8 men going to work at midnight. Imagine, we sat there talking to the police. Then we went up to the 8th floor, walked down to the 6th, and do you believe it? We couldn't open that door, and we had to cancel the operation. I don't believe it has ever been told before, but all the time while we were working on the door, McCord would be going to the 8th floor. It is still a mystery to me what he was doing there. At 2 a.m., I went up to tell him about our problems, and there I saw him talking to 2 guards. What happened, I thought. Have we been caught? No. He knew the guards. So I did not ask questions, but I thought maybe McCord was working there. It was the only thing that made sense. He was the one who led us to the place, and it would not have made sense for us to have rooms at the Watergate and go on this operation if there was not someone there on the inside. Anyway, I joined the group, and pretty soon we picked up our briefcases and walked out the front door. Eduardo was furious that Gonzalez hadn't been able to open the door. Gonzalez explained he didn't have the proper equipment, so Eduardo told him to fly back to Miami to go get his other tools. Before he left the next day, Barker told Gonzalez that he might have to pay for his own flight back to Miami. I really got mad and told Barker I resented the way they were treating Gonzalez. I was a little hard on with Barker. I said there wasn't adequate operational preparation. There was no floor plan of the building. No one knew the disposition of the elevators, how many guards there were, or even what time the guards checked the building. Gonzalez did not know what kind of door he was supposed to open. There wasn't even any contingency plans. Barker came back to me with a message from Eduardo. You are an operative. Your mission is to do what you are told and not to ask questions. Gonzalez got back from Miami that night with his whole shop. I've never seen so many tools to open a door. No door could hold him. This time, everything worked. Gonzalez and Sturgis picked the lock in the garage exit door. Once inside, they opened the other doors and called over the walkie-talkie. The horse is in the house. Then they let us in. I took a lot of photographs, maybe 30 or 40, showing lists of contributors that Barker had handed me. McCord worked on the phones. He said his first 2 taps might be discovered, but not the third. With our mission accomplished, we went back to the hotel. It was about 5 a.m. Eduardo said he was happy, but this time there was no champagne. He said we should leave for Miami right away. I gave him the film I had taken and we left for the airport. There were things that bothered me about the operation, but I was satisfied. It is rare that you are able to check the effect of your work in the intelligence community. You know, they don't tell you if something you did is very significant, but we had taken a lot of pictures of contributions and I had hopes that we might have done something valuable. We all had heard rumors in Miami that McGovern was receiving money from Castro. That was nothing new. We believe that today. A couple of weeks later, I was talking with Felipe de Diego and Frank Sturgis at our real estate office when Barker burst in like a cyclone. Eduardo had been in town, and he had given Barker some film to have developed and enlarged. Barker did not know what the film was, and he had taken it to a regular camera shop. And then Eduardo had told him it was the film from the Watergate operation. Barker was really excited. He needed us to come with him to get it back. So we went to Rich's camera shop, and Barker told Frank and me to cover each door to the shop in case the police came while he was inside. I do not think he handled the situation very well. There were all these people, and he was so excited. He ended up tipping the man at the store $20 or $30. The man had just enlarged the pictures showing the documents being held by a gloved hand, and he said to Barker, "It's real cloak and dagger stuff, isn't it?" Later, that man went to the FBI and told them about the film. My reaction was that it was crazy to have those important pictures developed in a common place in Miami. But Barker was my close friend, and I could not tell him how wrong the whole thing was. The thing about Barker was that he trusted Hunt. He trusted Eduardo totally. He had been his principal assistant at the Bay of Pigs, Eduardo's liaison with the Cubans, and he still believed tremendously in this man. He was just blind about him. It was too much for me. I talked it over with Felipe and Frank, and decided I could not continue. I was about to write a letter when Barker told me Eduardo wanted us to get ready for another operation in Washington. When you are in this kind of business and you are in the middle of something, it is not easy to stop. Everyone will feel that you might jeopardize the operation. What to do with this guy now? I knew it would create a big problem, so I agreed to go on this last mission. Eduardo told us to buy surgical gloves and 40 rolls of film with 36 exposures on a roll. Imagine, that meant 1,440 photographs. I told Barker it would be impossible to take all those pictures, but it did seem to mean that what we got before encouraged Eduardo to go back for more. We flew into the national airport about noon on June 16th, and Barker and I went off to rent a car. In the airport lobby, Frank Sturgis ran into Jack Anderson, whom he had known since the Bay of Pigs, when Anderson wrote a column about him as a soldier adventurer. Jack Anderson's the same guy that Hunt and Liddy met with that CIA poisons expert about assassinating him. And also they had discussed how they would use a vehicle to hit his car at a certain angle that was known to be deadly, that they apparently utilize. Yeah, very interesting. But Frank Sturgis introduced Gonzalez to Anderson, Jack Anderson, the journalist, and he gave him some kind of excuse about why he was in town. On our way to the Watergate, we made some jokes about the car Barker had rented. It gave me a premonition of a hearse. The mission was not one I was looking forward to. Eduardo was waiting for us at the Watergate. This time he had 2 operations planned, and we were supposed to perform them both that night. There was no time for anything. It was all rush. We went to eat at about 5 o'clock. Barker ate a lot, and when he came back, he felt really bad. I was not feeling too good myself. I had just gotten my divorce that day and had gone from the court to the airport and from the airport to the Watergate. The environment in each one of us was different, but the whole thing was bad. There was tension in those people. Liddy was already in the room when Eduardo came in to give the briefing. Eduardo was wearing loafers and black pants with white stripes. They were very shiny. Liddy was not happy with those pants. He criticized them in front of us, and he told Eduardo to go change them. Daddy told Eduardo. So Eduardo went and changed his pants. The briefing he gave when he came back was very simple. He said, we were going to photograph more documents at the Democratic headquarters and then move on to another mission at the McGovern headquarters after that. McCord was critical of the second operation. He said he didn't like the plan. It was very rare to hear McCord talking because usually he didn't say anything, and when he did talk, he only whispered. Before we left, Eduardo took all of our identification. He put it in a briefcase and left it in our room. He gave Sturgis his Edward J. Hamilton identification that the CIA had provided to him before, and he gave us each $200 in cash. He said we should use it as a bribe to get away if we were caught. Finally, he told us to keep the keys to our room, where he had left the identification. I don't know why. Even today, I don't know. Remember, I was told in advance not to ask about those things. McCord went into the Watergate very early in the evening. He walked right through the front door of the office complex, signed the book, and I'm sure went to the 8th floor as he had before. Then he taped the doors from the 8th floor to the bottom floor and walked out through the exit door in the garage. It was still very early, and we were not going to go in until after everyone left the offices. We waited so long that Eduardo went out to check if the tapes were still there. He said they were, but when we finally got ready to go in, Virgilio and Sturgis noticed that the tape was gone and a sack of mail was at the door. So we said, well, the tape has been discovered. We'll have to abort the operation. But McCord thought we should go anyway. He went upstairs and tried to convince Liddy and Eduardo that we should go ahead. Before making a decision, they went to the other room. I believe they made a phone call, and Eduardo told us to go ahead. McCord did not come in with us. He said he had to go someplace. We never knew where he was going. Anyway, he was not with us, so when Virgilio picked the locks to let us in, we put tape on the doors for him and went upstairs. 5 minutes later, McCord came in, and I asked him right away, "Did you remove the tapes?" He said, "Yes, I did." But he did not, because the tape was later found by the police. Once inside, McCord told Barker to turn off his walkie-talkie. He said there was too much static, so we were there without communications. Soon we started hearing noises, people going up and down. McCord said it was only the people checking like before, but then there was running and men shouting, "Come out with your hands up or we'll shoot," and things like that. There was no way out. We were caught. The police were very rough with us, pushing us around, tying our arms, but Barker was able to turn on his walkie-talkie, and he asked where the police were from. And then he said, "Oh, you are the Metropolitan policemen who catch us." So Barker was cool. He did a good job at advising Eduardo we were caught. I thought right away it was a setup or something like that because it was so easy the first time. We all had that feeling. They took our keys and found the identification in the briefcase Eduardo had left in the room. McCord was the senior officer and he took charge. He was talking loudly now. He told us not to say a thing. "Don't give your names. Nothing. I know people. Don't worry. someone will come and everything will be all right. This thing will be solved. So that's essentially what happens to the five at the Watergate,
Yep.
which I honestly, man, when you realize that Hunt and McCord, I mean, Hunt, McCord, and Liddy, they all essentially got away. You know what I mean? Like McCord was, it's just like, it's so crazy to me, man. Like that, of course, that's how it would happen. Sturgis and the Cubans, they all get fucked. Yeah, 100%. So, in my opinion, especially when you come away from all of this with a better understanding of the individuals, and then once you realize, once we sort of outline the actual secret agenda at hand, which even individuals who it really does seem like there are different levels of being read in to each of these agendas as well. So it's not even that each of the individuals are fully aware of the agenda itself that they are pursuing or facilitating. And so it's kind of covert operations, man. They're sophisticated and very unique. But once you kind of realize how they function, you can at the very least kind of realize the way to approach it in dissecting and interpreting how they operate on the ground strategically, as far as just operationally sound, the tactics and strategies they utilize. Because once you have a better knowledge of that and you have a better grasp of all of that, then this isn't hard to understand. It's really not hard to understand. It all just perfectly clicks in. It's like the chalk outline. You know what I mean? It's like, honestly. So
yeah, which in next episode we'll start getting into more of the circumstances of the how this went down, and then kind of what we can speculate from there. So it's going to get a lot more juicy next episode. But yeah, we're kind of laying down all the little bits of info that you need to be able to understand this better. But probably at a good spot to end this now. Maybe we'll touch back on this here soon. Let people know where they can find you, and we'll get out of here, bud.
All right, my brother. Guys, just follow the podcast anywhere you can find it at the Underclass Podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube at the Underclass Podcast. My Instagram, the same thing, and my Twitter is at UnderclassPod.
Yep. And if you guys want to, go ahead.
On Patreon at Buzzsprout as well, by the way.
Sorry, didn't mean to step
You're
on
good,
you.
buddy.
But yeah, if you guys want to support me, patreon.com. It's just No Way Jose 2020. The lowest level gives you the early content, usually roughly about a week earlier than the public. And also you can be a talking head on me and Austin's live call-in show. You get the StreamYard link if you're on the $2 level or higher. And the highest level, I read them off every episode. That's my co-host on Tower Gang, at Tower Gang Toad. I have at Abrogate D's, at ZOVERACK, then at _ Infinite Zeal, then Jacob Daniel of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, at Biblical Anarchy, the homie Tim Tuttle, at Jolly on Klebold, and my buddy Will Bell, who makes this delicious Rabbit Eye blueberry wine. Highly recommend you go get that. You can go get that online. Just look up Rabbit Eye. I think it might even just be like rabbiteye.com or something like that. But yeah, look it up. Good stuff. But yeah, we'll have another one of these for you here soon. And with that, we are out. Follow me at Tower Gang Jose. Bye.